I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon, which is on engaging in evidence-informed maths activities for 3 to 7-year-olds. We're really pleased that you'll be joining us here for the next hour. To begin our webinar this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge and show my respect to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining you from, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to First Nations people and elders past and present. I know that you'll be joining us from many places this afternoon, so please feel free to use the chat box to put in the traditional lands that you're joining us from. At Evidence for Learning and Social Ventures Australia, we recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are inviting us quite generously to walk together on the journey towards reconciliation. We support their calls for a voice to Parliament protected in the Constitution. So, official welcome. We're here today to talk about maths in the early years, so covering early childhood education and primary school settings. To start off with, I'd like to introduce myself and then also take a moment to introduce you to the wonderful panellists who we'll be hearing from this afternoon. So my name is Hannah Matthews and I'm an Associate Director at Evidence for Learning, but my background is in teaching and in primary school teaching specifically. I've also worked across education policy and research spaces throughout the course of my career. With me this afternoon, I don't know if you'll be able to see her, but we have the Director of Evidence for Learning, Danielle Toon. She is managing the chat and she'll be sharing links with you throughout the course of this webinar, so you will see her name pop up. I'm very pleased to be joined by our panellists today. We have Professor Marina Papic, James Ellis and Juanita Milne, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them now. Marina Papic is a Professor of Early Childhood and Mathematics Education at ACU. She has worked in the education sector for 38 years and has held various teaching, academic and leadership roles and has also led large research projects. James Ellis is a nationally certified lead teacher. He has 20 years of experience in initial teacher education and also in schools, including early learning and primary contexts. Juanita Milne is an early childhood teacher who has worked in the sector for 18 years. She is passionate about preparing children and their families for school through age-appropriate teaching methods. As you can see and hear, our panellists have a real wealth of expertise and experience, which I look forward to drawing on this afternoon. And I, for one, am really excited about the insights around early maths that they will be sharing with us. This is our agenda for the next hour or so. Most of our time will be spent in the panel discussion. But before we get into the panel discussion and the good bits, I suppose, I'd really like to take you through who we for L are and also our guidance report, which underpins our webinar today. We'll then move into the panel discussion so you can hear from the experts in the room, and it will be based around 3 key themes, which are using maths throughout the day, supporting children to use manipulatives and representations, and also understanding and building on what children know. After the panel discussion, we may have time for some of your questions, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A box as we're going through today. Depending on how we're going for time towards the end will depend on how many or if any we're able to get to. But on that note, I'd really like to thank all of you for the questions that you submitted when you were registering for this webinar. We've incorporated quite a few questions and quite a few key themes from the questions that have come through. So hopefully when the panellists are responding to the questions, you can kind of hear the train of thought that you were asking reflected in those responses and in the questions. The other thing to note is that all of the evidence for learning resources that we talk about today are available for free on the E4L website, and we'll share links with you, as I've said, in the chat as we go, so you can go and have a bit of an explore after the webinar. So if you're not overly familiar with Evidence for Learning, I'll spend just a moment to orientate you and tell you a little bit about us. We are an independent not-for-profit and we work across the early years and school settings in all states, all territories and all sectors. We were founded in 2015 and we operate as part of Social Ventures Australia. We partner with international evidence brokers, including our founding partners in the UK from the Education Endowment Foundation, who some of you may have heard of or come across before. And we really specialise in translating evidence and then helping to implement that in education settings. Educators and those working with children and young people are at the centre of what we do, which you can read and see in the mission statement on the slide there. As I've mentioned, everything that we talk through today from Evidence for Learning is free and available on the website now. If you haven't had a chance to look at our resources before, you're very welcome to do so. If you are interested in staying up to date on Evidence for Learning and getting to know who we are and what we do, we have a monthly e-newsletter, which you are very welcome to sign up for, and Danielle will put the link in the chat for that now. You're also welcome to follow us on whichever your chosen social media platform is too, and you can see our details on the screen there. So why did we choose to focus on maths in the early years? Well, as you can read from the quote on the screen, a solid understanding of maths is really important for children while they're young and while they're with you in your contexts. But it also continues to be important for them as they learn and they grow. Strong foundations in maths are very important as children progress through school, and they're associated with their later achievement. We also know that this year, for many of you, maths is an area of focus. So in a nutshell, that's the reason why we've published this particular guidance report and the resources on maths in the early years, and it's also why we're here with you in this webinar today. Our early maths guidance report is based on a rapid systematic review of the best available international and Australian evidence. The guidance report has been reviewed and contextualised to help make it relevant for Australian audiences by 4 reviewers, James Ellis and Professor Marina Papic, who are in the room with us today, and also Dr. Lee Disney and Dr. Liang Lee from Monash University helped us with that process. We also had input from Australian educators in early childhood education and primary school contexts who shared examples of what the recommendations look like in their particular settings. Juanita Milne is one of the educators who has shared an example from her context, and you can see that she is a panellist here with us today as well. There are 5 evidence-based recommendations in this guidance report, and we'll go into more details around the recommendations 2, 3 and 4 in the panel discussion shortly. I'll just give you a whistle-stop tour of recommendations 1 and 5 so as you get a bit of a flavour for what's in the guidance report. Obviously, it's all there for you to go and take a look at those, so please feel free to go through and have a click through in the guidance report where you can find a lot more information. So the first recommendation is to develop educators' understanding of how children learn maths. And this recommendation really speaks to professional development as well as educators knowing what common misconceptions are for children when they are learning maths, and utilising things like developmental progressions as another information point to understand how most children typically learn in most circumstances. The 5th recommendation and the final recommendation is around targeted support to make sure that all children are learning maths. There will be times where children will need targeted small group or one-on-one support to continue to make progress in maths. And the evidence that underpins this recommendation suggests that regular sessions with a particular focus on a specific concept can help to make sure that children can really get that strong grasp and that foundational grasp on maths knowledge. So that's a very quick overview of some of the recommendations in the guidance report. Before we dive into our panel discussion, I'll also let you know that the questions that you submitted during the registration, a lot of them were around seeking hands-on experiences and the practical application of activities that you might be able to use with children. And I just wanted to flag now that many of those will be covered in what Marina and James and Juanita are speaking to you about this afternoon. And there are also some wonderful examples in that guidance report too. So again, I encourage you to have a look if you're kind of getting a sense of that as we go through. All right. Without keeping you for any longer, it's time to hear from our panellists and get into our panel discussion for this evening. So our first panel discussion is focused on the theme of maths throughout the day. And in the early years, there are opportunities throughout the day, every day, for children to be learning about maths, whether that's through play or the environment or the routines that you already have set up or that you may like to establish, and also through your intentional teaching. So maths throughout the day includes using mathematical language with children and discussing mathematical ideas to extend on their thinking. So this might be exploring capacity in water play or discussing the properties of shapes that children can spot in nature. It's also looking out for opportunities to have extended discussions on mathematical ideas with them. When it comes to intentional teaching, the evidence suggests that there should be dedicated time each day for purposeful mathematics activity and teaching that really should help support children to develop specific mathematical ideas and skills based on what they already know and what they can do. So to kick us off with this panel discussion, I might hand over to Marina first. Marina, in the guidance report, maths talk is a concept that was highlighted. Can you explain to us what this is and how educators may be able to incorporate maths talk throughout their day?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. You all as educators interact with your children throughout the day. You ask questions, you share ideas, and maths talk is just an extension of these wonderful interactions that you already have, but it has a purposeful mathematics focus. Maths talk is that collaborative process where children's thinking and their ideas and the strategies they use to solve problems are discussed and shared with yourself as the educator, but also with peers. So when you are purposeful about using maths talk in your classroom, you support children to share their mathematical thinking. And this gives you a wonderful insight into your children's understanding, but also some of the misunderstandings or misconceptions they might have about a particular maths concept. All of this supports your planning cycle. However, maths talk doesn't just happen. Just like any other part of the curriculum, you need to plan for it. So consider the experiences that you plan that have a clear mathematical intention, and then identify the opportunities within that experience that you could have rich dialogue with children, that maths talk could occur throughout that experience. So you've got to plan for that. And I'll give you an example. If you're wanting to explore units of measure with children, you could read the storybook, Alexander's Outing. And I don't know if you know the story, but little Alexander he's a duck and he goes for a walk with his friends and he falls into a hole. And the only way to get him out is to pour water into the hole and let him rise to the top. So after reading the story and having some conversations and picking up on some of those maths concepts, you could provide children with opportunities to get their own toy Alexander out of the hole. So you use like a large jar or a plumbing pipe, lots of different size containers and water, and encouraging children to record their findings through representations like pictures and tally marks and other markings. And you're encouraging children each time to estimate how many containerfuls of water it will take to get Alexander to rise to the top. So here in this example that I've just given you, educators have a wonderful opportunity to ask the children to share their estimations and the ideas and the strategies that they used to identify that estimate. So while children are explaining and defending their estimations, you get a really good insight into their understanding of the size of units, their understanding that the larger the unit, so in this case, the container, the less of them the child will need to get Alexander out. And the opposite to that is the smaller the unit or the smaller the container, the more of them they'll need. And in this example, the educator can intentionally select particular solutions or strategies for the maths talk. So talking about, for example, how many containerfuls each time, and encouraging children to refer to those representations and explain their recordings and their thinking. You can see with this one experience that through Maths Talk, there is an opportunity for children to articulate and justify their ideas and solutions, and also an opportunity for children to understand the reasoning of other children. So children may have different solutions or different strategies that they used, and it's really important while they share these that Maths Talk supports children to connect and compare these different approaches. And I guess finally, when engaging in Maths Talk, I would suggest thinking about the language that you model to children and the open-endedness of your questions. And I encourage you to give children time to think. Silence is okay. It doesn't mean children don't know the response. It means that they're processing and they're thinking. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Marina. I think there were quite a few gems in what you've just said there. I think even at the end, though, just a reminder around silence being golden and giving children that time to process and respond. But I also particularly liked what you said about being specific in your planning and what is it that you're aiming to get out of, like the book Alexander's Outing. It's really rich as a text. So what's the focus area and what are you trying to get out of that? That actually leads really nicely into something else that came up in the guidance report around storybooks and them being a really wonderful resource to discuss and explore mathematical concepts and ideas. James, I know in your context you use books in maths with the children that you're teaching. Could you tell us how you plan for these experiences and give us an example of what it looks like in your context?
Sure, thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Marina. Can I just get a thumbs up, Hannah, that you can hear me okay? Wonderful, thank you very much. So on screen, you'll see something coming up. I work in a birth to year 6 setting. So we look at work samples together, and we have a group of people, we call them a PLC, a professional learning community, and there are 3 people in my PLC, which I lead. And we looked at this work sample and we believed that this was potentially a foundation sort of level of understanding within our cohort. And our cohort can be anywhere from 60 children to 90 children with 2 to 3 teachers and 2 additional educators as support. And so we're looking at a lot of work samples. This is just one of them. And we're thinking, how can we cater for our foundation learners? And then we looked at the next slide, which is, we went into the guidance report on page 16 and had to look at, rich maths texts. And I had a bit of a preview of 10 as a crab, 1 as a snail beforehand, and I found a clip on YouTube which read the story out, and it had some visuals, and I thought, I'll take this to my PLC, I'll talk to my co-teachers and ask them, perhaps, could we do this as a group, or could we do this as a small group? Will it address our foundation year 1 learners? Will it address all our learners? And we got into it. We had a few previews as a group, and we decided unanimously that we'd do it with 90 students because we could see lots of different entry points within this text. If you haven't looked at it, I really encourage you to bookmark it later on and watch it tomorrow, because we found it was super rich. I'll talk you through what we did. We decided that we thought, how can we make this a point where we can have a look at the text, have discussions as a group, and give the children some thinking time, perhaps like what Marina was recommending prior to this. And we thought we'd use the YouTube clip. We'd ask the students to demonstrate their understanding using a dictogloss technique in their maths book, so to speak, or on their paper. And this is an example of what the children came up with. And remember, my learners are from, in this setting, they're a 10-year-old student, but our understanding levels are from foundation, plus. And this is one of our students. So we're encouraging the students to show us through pictures, show us through representations, and try and do both of those before you get into numerals and numbers. Show us what you know. And so we could watch the maths text online together as a group, and we could pause it 4 or 5 times as we went through. And it was super remarkable to see the different representations, particularly, and I've zoomed in one there for you just to check it out. I think had I have worked with kindergarten age students, 4-year-olds, we would have paused this movie of this maths text, and we would have built this with Play-Doh. We would have put it into shaving cream on mirrors. We would have got super into the index fingers and drawn things. And I think at the level that we're working at Trinity Gardens, we worked at this level, which was pretty good. And this is a very well presented one. They're not all like this, but it was super fun to get into it. And I'll go to my next slide, Hannah. I believe it's there. Yep. And this is, you know, perhaps 1 or 2 hours of working with the text and questioning and pausing and discussing. This is some of the problem solving work that we asked the students to do as groups. So we said, look, can you make 27 legs in 4 different ways, you know, from all of this rich information that you recorded on your pages, get together and think about how many humans, crabs, spiders, snails, and, you know, what can you do? Knowing that this is pushing our kids with algebraic reasoning through their thinking, but they didn't know it, I guess. They were, you know, they were just really into the vibe of this text. So even if you think that cover looked very kiddie, this really works for 4-year-olds all the way through, right up to the algebraic reasoning. And you can see some of the formations of it there. So thanks so much, Hannah. And we'll jump over to the next point.
Thank you. Thank you, James. I think that's a really nice example of being able to use a text to cater for, you know, all ages and stages in terms of what's appropriate and where children can join in, and the supports that you have in place to allow them to do that as well, through the planning with your colleagues to determine what the children in your care need. Thank you for that example. I'm going to move us on next to Juanita. And Juanita, you work in a busy early learning setting, and one of the things that came through in the guidance report is, you know, finding ways to embed maths throughout the day. So whether that's through routines or play or through contexts like games or songs. Did you want to give us an example of how you do that in your context?
Yeah, sure. Whatamuli, everyone. I'm on Bindal and Walgarookaba ground here in Townsville. So maths in my routines, my daily transition routine, the children line up, I'll use ordinal numbers like first, second, third, etc., or directional language. So can you go behind, beside, in front of Johnny when lining up to go outside? When we're at the meal table, how many plates do we need for this table? And the children, you'll see the children go around using their one-to-one correspondence and counting everyone that's at the table. And I'll sometimes hand out 1 or 2 less, and I'll role play. Oh, I haven't got enough. How many more do I need? I may put a stack of plates in the middle of the table, and I'll either put too many or too few. And the children will soon tell me if I've that I've made a mistake. And so I'll ask them, okay, well, how many more do I need, or how many less should I have put out? I play games. I've managed to source some larger playing cards from the cheap shop. And we sequence the numbers in order, forwards, backwards. We play Go Fish, Snap, 1 more or less. We have a beautiful Indigenous puzzle that the children love putting together, but it's actually snakes and ladders as well. So then once they've put it together, they then get to play a game of snakes and ladders. So they're rolling a dice with the eventual hope that by doing it more and more and more, that they're then sabotaging. So they're not having to count the dots on the dice. Songs, I love music, so I'm always singing transition songs, Current Buns, Cheeky Monkeys, 10 in the Bed, 5 Little Ducks, counting backwards. So that concept of counting backwards. I love Jack Hartman songs. My children last year were particularly fond of the 12 months of the year song, so they're getting up and they're moving as well. For time, when you wake up in the morning, that kind of rhyming song. And I've also created charts with the children. Part of the ERS, we use the environmental rating scale to provide a literacy rich environment, and part of that is numeracy as well. And looking at phonetics, so syllables in children's names and clapping out the syllables. And we then made a chart. Okay, these children here have 3 syllables in their name. These children have 4 syllables, etc. Or we've done charts with, okay, children with siblings, and we group them by how many children have, and then you can break it up. So how many have brothers, how many have sisters? So yeah, there's lots and lots of maths that you probably are already doing and you just don't realize it. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Juanita. That was quite an array of examples from your particular setting. It sounds as though the children that you have are just exposed to these great ways of practicing and talking about maths and maths concepts every day. And you're also speaking about it really naturally as well, which makes me think that this is just an embedded part of your practice and what you do, which is really lovely to hear. Hopefully for those of you that are listening along, you're hearing some of the examples and thinking about what this looks like in your practice and in your context as well. I'm sure some of the resources like the books that we're talking about or the songs that Juanita has mentioned, even the card games, I'm sure that some of you are doing these things within your context already, or they're things that you may be able to consider implementing quite quickly if you would like to. I can see Danielle's popped a few things in the chat, but just quickly before we go on, there's 2 things that I want to mention for you on the E4L website, which Danielle will drop a link in the chat in. One of them is that Juanita has very kindly shared an example of practice video around how she embeds maths in her mealtime routines at her particular setting, which is very good to watch and get some ideas on what you might be able to do too. The other thing is we have a 1-page guide on using storybooks to promote high quality talk or high quality mathematical talks. You can find both of those on the website in our early maths guidance report page. So both of those are worth a look if this is kind of resonating with you so far. But I will move us on to our next panel discussion, which is looking at supporting children to use manipulatives and representations. So very quickly, a few key terms here. A manipulative is an object that you can interact with and move to represent mathematical ideas. It's everything from buttons, shells and rocks to resources like MAB or base 10 blocks, Unifix cubes or Numicon, which you may have seen in your contexts. A representation is the way that maths can be represented through things like drawings or tally marks or mathematical symbols. Think about things like graphs and number lines. They're all representations that we use. In the guidance report, the evidence shows that manipulatives and representations can be really powerful tools for supporting young children to engage with ideas across many parts of maths. They can also help educators to see what children understand and can provide a bridge to abstract thinking. The evidence on using manipulatives and representations has some considerations for effective practice, which you can see on the screen. They're really around making sure that children understand the link between the manipulative that they're using and the mathematical idea that they represent. That you have a clear rationale as an educator for using a particular manipulative or representation to teach a specific concept, that you're encouraging children to represent problems in their own ways. So if there's symbols that they want to use, or if they're wanting to use their fingers, that kind of thing is very encouraged. Know that novelty manipulatives can be distracting, and so sometimes it's good to introduce them first and let that novelty wear off a little bit, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And, you know, using manipulatives and representations are really a wonderful way to open up discussions about mathematics with children. So for this panel discussion, I might ask Juanita first, in your context, how is it that you introduce manipulatives to the children in your setting, and how do you help them to understand the link between the manipulative and the idea that it's representing?
Yeah, so I have baskets around my room, my science, my maths and my home corners. There's loose parts galore. I have a dedicated Mobilo trolley with baskets for each of the different pieces. So I have a bucket for all of the head pieces. I have a bucket of the red cubes, another for the yellow pieces, another for the wheels, connectors, etc. There's visual suggestions for the children to follow, like they come with the Mobilo kits come with cards. So on one side, there's the completed construction, and on the other side, there's actually the pieces that are required to make it. If I'm asked to help a child, I will actually start on the required pieces side and point to each one, asking them how many of each piece they need, and then I'll use directional language to guide them in piecing it together. Other examples, so for Easter, I placed 2 transparent eggs in my science area. With a basket of natural materials. I started a pattern of cut branches in a zigzag pattern, and then I used made some dotted patterns with some shells. Outside in the mud kitchen, water, sand, and reel equipment are on offer to measure volume with metric measuring cups, and we explore capacity, full, half, half full, etc. Play-Doh, we explore fractions, breaking the whole dough into half, sharing it out with everyone at the table. And we also have, we were focusing on fine motor skills. So one-to-one correspondence feeding games. There was actually some tweezers, and they had to feed the bones to the dog, the carrots to the rabbit, etc. So counting them as they go. Also being timed, so how many can you feed the animal in, say, 30 seconds. So yeah, lots of stuff happening.
Thank you, Anita. Very quickly, because I think this is a nice example, we've just got in the chat, what do we mean by novelty features of manipulatives? I would say that perhaps the bone and the dog example, it might be very cute, right? And it might be a fluffy object that the children think is adorable. That's probably a bit of a novelty. So you might introduce that first, so as the children can give the dog a name or have a play with the bones before introducing that mathematical concept with them. So just using that as an example there. Thank you for that, Anita. It again sounds as though you have so many examples in your setting that the children are engaged with on a daily basis. I'm going to ask James now. Your setting, as you kind of alluded to, is somewhat unique in that you have children aged from birth all the way through to the end of year 6. I know not everyone here will be in that exact same context, but we all work with children at different ages and different stages of development. So can you tell us a little bit about how manipulatives are used in your setting and how the use of them might change as children's development and understanding progresses?
Sure. So I'll just backtrack a little bit and talk about buddy systems, because I'm super keen on buddy systems. When I worked in a kindergarten, we really looked forward to the buddies coming over from the primary school to our setting. And now that I'm in the primary school, I really appreciate over the several years that I've worked where I do to bring my 10-year-olds over to help the 4-year-olds in the kindergarten. And one of the things that a couple of things we've worked at over the years are informal measurements. So we work on fine motor skills, gross motor skills. When we work with informal measurements, we work with jumping and predicting how far to jump in our little activities. And you can imagine a setting where there's several teachers, several early childhood educators, but a whole lot of 10-year-olds leading small activities with little ones. They get feedback very, very quickly, much quicker than what we can provide as adults. And they also get the encouragement, and they're in a small, a little cone of silence from us, but they're with their, an older role model. And so in that setting, what we've done in the past over the years is worked with, can you do 2 jumps here? And then how many jumps will it take to get to that cone? How many steps will it take? How many footprints will it take? That sort of thing. And then we used the example on screen, which was a nature play example. And we measured bits of, arms and legs, and how many sticks will it take to measure the height of Harry? And then we also have a nature play area where we could say, how many Harrys would it be to take in measurement for that entire log? And so they lay across the log and lay down and measure themselves. So really interacting on a fun and concrete level with manipulatives is something that the kids really look forward to. And I guess the beauty about all of that is that the educators are standing up straight for once in that setting and watching. So it becomes an observing assessment tool. And I guess there's opportunities for iPads and clipboards in terms of anecdotal evidence, or, even bringing out the 4-year-old reports at the end of the semester and thinking, is what we've written here in, their, spatial awareness, is this what we're seeing when they're working through these activities? And the staff of the 4-year-olds really appreciate the time that buddy zone gives them to just watch and observe. So if you haven't started yet, team up with someone from a site across the road and get them involved, because it could give you a new experience and a new environment.
Thank you, James. I think that's a really lovely example. And I especially liked what you were saying in terms of the educators and teachers in that setting, being able to step back a little bit and really observe what's happening at that whole class kind of level. And, there's really good opportunities in there for your own observations, or where you might think, oh, I've got a really good question that I might be able to ask, or have you considered this? And where you step in and where you just watch, I think that's really interesting. And I especially like your informal measurements around how many Harrys does it take to make this log. I think we can all relate to that. Marina, the guidance report indicates that educators should consider how representations will be used to build on children's existing understanding, but also to then help them develop increasingly sophisticated approaches and ideas. You've done a lot of research on patterning. How can educators support children to represent their mathematical understanding?
Yeah, and look, I want to acknowledge James's example as well of that early algebraic thinking. It's a lovely example in this context as well. But one way in which children communicate that mathematical thinking and their solution strategies is through representation. And the very first step as educators to support children to represent their mathematical understanding is to provide them with that opportunity and the materials that they can use to represent. So if, for example, you're provisioning an environment for pattern making, and you'll see on the photo on the screen, which has 2 environments that have been set up with different resources that children can use, different manipulatives to make various patterns. You'll also see there's a clipboard with some paper and some pens there as well, which gives children that opportunity to represent their patterns. And that provides opportunities for lovely conversations about what they represented, how it relates to the concrete materials that they use to make the pattern. And it doesn't always have to be paper, so you can think broader than that. Technology is also a great tool that provides representational opportunities. So it's thinking about the spaces that you've already got in your room that you've set up. For me, that was patterning. It could be other concepts that you're developing and you're setting up the environments to provide those opportunities. Do you have an opportunity there for children to represent their thinking, to represent the concrete representation that they've made, and be able to represent it through drawings or markings or symbols? So asking children to represent their mathematical thinking is a way that you can identify what their current understanding is. And my example is a research project I did with preschoolers that was focused specifically on developing patterning and early algebraic thinking. And I wanted to understand children's current understanding of patterns before I sort of went into that planning cycle, and I thought about the experiences and opportunities I wanted to provide children. So children were provided with the opportunity to represent what they thought a pattern was through constructions and photos and through drawings. And you'll see on the screen at the moment, there are 3 examples of the drawn representations by Sam, Luca and Thea. As the children talk through their representations of patterns, and I put a little bit of that dialogue there for you, you can see from that what their understanding is. I could see that Sam sees patterns as a print or a design, but I could see from his drawing that there is some regularity in those footprints. Thea, on the other hand, understands that patterns are units of repeat. And in this case, it's the red and yellow that's repeated in the rainbow. Her drawing shows that she completed the pattern on the correct colour, and she's got the complete pattern there. Luca's representation and sharing of what he has drawn shows a very sophisticated understanding of patterns. He made 2 repeating patterns, 2 different ones, one with 4 items twice, and they were the flowers, and the other with 3 items 4 times, and that was the grass. And he has a very good understanding of patterns as unit of repeat, and that the flowers are a different pattern structure to the grass. So these representations that you can see are a wonderful way to talk about children's understanding of patterns, and then from this, that can inform your planning cycle. Talking about the representation also supports you to have a better insight into not just children's understandings, but misunderstandings as well. If you look at the pictures on the screen now, of Sally, I think that's come up for you now. Sally is drawing the pattern. What she's doing is she's showing a repeating pattern, but it's a hopscotch pattern. And I don't know if you've ever used hopscotch patterns with children, but it's a little bit more sophisticated, and it develops children thinking a little bit further than just linear patterns. So the pattern goes horizontally and vertically, and it's still a repetition of a pattern, but you're looking at it from going in 2 different directions. Hopscotch patterns are really great to do with children once you've done those linear patterns. And in Sally's drawing, the pattern that she's created with the tiles and then drawn through the representation is actually the teddy bear's perspective rather than her own. So she's got the teddy on the opposite side of the table, so it's at a 180-degree position to where she's sitting. And what she needs to do is visualize what it looks like for the teddy when the teddy's looking up at the pattern. And you'll see there not just the drawing, but the conversation that went with it. So the maths talk that Sally had with the teacher. And it highlights Sally's understanding of pattern structure and her skills in being able to visualize and her deep reasoning skills. She refers to a previously made pattern, and that shows her ability to abstract the pattern structure and generalize it. So what I'm trying to show here for you is the representations really show that child's depth of understanding, but it sits beautifully with the maths talk, because using the 2 together, you get a better and deeper and richer understanding of what children really understand in that area or that idea of mathematics. Now, these ideas that you're seeing at the moment are quite sophisticated for 4-year-olds. Children don't normally start with these types of representation. Sally and the children in her class had lots of opportunities to represent simple patterns, and they used lots of different manipulatives and mediums and looked at it from various perspectives. Before they moved into those complex ones like the hopscotch patterns, and we did cyclic patterns and other types of patterns. So you'll see some of those patterns there on the next screen, which started off with simple A-B patterns. So while children are representing their mathematical ideas, my suggestion to you is to really listen to what they're saying. Look for those pauses when they're representing. It gives you an insight into the strategy that they're using, and engage in that maths talk. And also compare those representations over time. That one down the bottom on the right-hand side is over an 8-month period, and you can see the change in the child's drawing, the sophistication in the shape of the square, and also in the complexity of the patterns. So just finally, representations along with the discourse or the maths talk that goes with it provides you with really meaningful insights into children's thinking and their understanding. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Marina. I think a really nice reminder for us around that maths talk and the importance of those conversations with children to really be able to try and uncover where they're coming from and what they're thinking is at that particular time. One more resource that we do have on the E4L website is a short video of practice by another educator called Co, and it's talking about how she uses Numicon manipulatives in her early learning setting. Danielle will pop a link to the chat to that video in just a moment, but that might also be worth having a look if you're interested in learning a little bit more about manipulatives. It's time though for our final panel discussion of the hour, and this is really about understanding and responding to what children know. And we've already started to touch on the key themes of that within the last few panel conversations. So we know that assessment plays an important role in helping educators to interpret what children know and then to be able to plan learning experiences for those children accordingly. There's a few things here to unpack from the evidence, which you can see on the screen. I guess children all have different starting points, so it's important to think about how you'll determine what they know to then plan for ways to extend and support on their learning. Early maths concepts also take time to develop, so observing a child demonstrating a skill in one context does not necessarily mean that their understanding is secure. It takes time to consolidate learning and transfer that learning into different contexts. So you'll need to check what children know in a variety of situations and using a variety of methods. This can include things like observations, specific activities designed for children to demonstrate their understanding, or discussions with children to hear more about their reasoning and their approaches to doing things. The other thing is that plan tasks that are targeted and carefully designed to reveal what children know can be quite valuable for then determining the next steps in your teaching. So coming back into that planning cycle. And on the note of that planning cycle, I'm going to hand straight over to Juanita. You, in your particular setting, use an observation cycle to help you and your colleagues to understand what children may know or may not know, and then plan for their learning. Could you give us a quick overview of what that process is in your setting and how you use it?
Yeah. So this is what I provided an example for the guidance report on. So I had some children building some Duplo. It was actually set up as a literacy experience, but Duplo is Duplo, and they were trying to go higher and higher and higher and higher. And eventually they asked for my help. And when I came closer, I noticed that there were actually two children behind, and they were measuring themselves against each other, as well as with the tower. So knowing that there was that interest there in height, we followed that up with creating a visual representation using streamers to create a height chart. Thank you, Marina, because that's something that I've learned from you. And it's a gorgeous array of colors. They got to choose their own streamer color. But that was my planning. Okay, they're interested in this is what I've observed. They've got that interest in height. Now let's represent it for them. So then, to further extend on that, to explore the concept of measuring length, I then got out some of these chains, and they measured it up against themselves, their own streamer, sorry, and then they went around the room. They tried to find something that was taller than them or shorter than them, or they broke it down, and they found, then they started measuring other things and seeing how many chains, say, the long block was. So yeah, and then I have been starting to do my overall theme and for my group's observations, and then breaking it down into, okay, well, this child requires some more development on this type of skill. So that's where I'll break it down. So it all links together from the one observation. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Hannah.
Thanks, Juanita. I think that's a really nice example of just how responsive you can be within a planning cycle. I think sometimes we think it has to be this big onerous thing, but actually that's really targeted and responsive. So I think that fits your children's needs really nicely. I'm rushing through here in the interest of time, but James, one of the key themes in this recommendation is around what educators do with the information that they collect. Can you talk through some of your reflections on planning for specific activities to gather information about what children know and how you and your team use that information?
Sure, no probs. I'll be as brief as I can be. I think it's pretty useful to use a student work sample. Perhaps we've heard about some of the different samples that this could look like today, and table it, you know, for a minute and just look at the work sample to plan from. I found the guidance report very helpful just because I could trust every example in it, that there was a lot of research that was built behind it. And I could just trust straight away that these go-tos were going to work for a situation if we all bought into it, and we did, and it worked. And it produced results that we didn't really expect in terms of, it produced students that I've showed, you know, the pictures of representations. It showed us where they were in their thinking. It showed us where they understood what number was, but they couldn't represent it with a numeral, but they could represent it with a picture. It gave them the freedom to do it their way. And so we could gauge some of the understanding where students were refusing to use numerals, but could show us that they understood increments, they could understand amounts, they could understand addition and subtraction, groupings, groups of 10, groups of 5. So looking at work samples, tabling them, and then having something like the guidance report, something like a best maths advice paper with you to then plan that next step. And I really like the visual representations within the guidance report. I found that was really useful to just look at these spirals and go, hang on, if this child's showing us this, what should they also know? Do they know this? Do they know this? The preceding bits of the progressions, and then the post bits up also. All of those help with the planning discussion. So I think having a work sample, having something that's trusted like the guidance report or another document that supports our planning, and then working together, spending 1 minute on each, and then making the next step. So it's a 5-minute process of making a decision together.
Thank you, James. I think that's also a really nice example in terms of responsiveness. And we all know that documentation and data collection can, again, sometimes feel quite onerous. So making those processes really work for responding to the needs of the children within your class, I think that's really good advice. Thank you for that. Marina, to finish us off today, the guidance report highlights the use of a variety of methods to help us assess children's mathematical understanding. And these range from one-to-one interactions to planned group observations, or just making a moment during the day to discuss children's mathematical reasoning. Could you share with us, what do you think are some of the considerations for educators when it comes to using assessment in maths in the early years?
Thanks, Hannah. I think one of the main considerations is that every moment is a learning opportunity. So every moment is an assessment opportunity. So whether it's a conversation with the child or an observation of something like a block construction or an interaction or an intentional mathematics experience, they're all opportunities for children to learn, but it's also an opportunity for you to assess, to observe and see what the children know and how you can build on that. What is important though is what you're capturing as part of that assessment. So ensuring that it is useful in terms of building your understanding of what children may know and understand and those misconceptions they have, and also what strategies they're using maybe to solve a problem or a task. So all of this will give you that lovely information that you need of a child's knowledge and understanding, and that supports that planning cycle. I think though there's a danger that we assess or document too much. Nowhere in the regs is there that, you know, requirement that we have to do, you know, 2 observations or 2 assessments a day or a week. Rather, really consider the value of your assessment. From a maths perspective, you need to know what the learning intention is when deciding what you'll assess. So assessment doesn't sit outside the learning experience or the learning intention, rather it's part of it. And this makes that assessment really authentic. I think the other component of assessment I'd like to stress is that maths talk is critical in really understanding that depth of children's thinking and understanding. So getting them to really explain what they're thinking or what their solution strategies are. Also consider that your assessment should show progression and development over time, similar to that patterning drawing I was showing you previously. And then finally, you know, your assessments need to value the cultural perspectives of children's learning. Learning and development is informed by children's culture and their values and their interactions with others and their experiences. So as educators, we need to use these culturally sensitive assessment approaches, make sure they're culturally and linguistically and developmentally appropriate. And this really makes that assessment process authentic. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Marina. I think those are some really sound considerations for all of us to be taking on board. And I'm sure that there is something that everyone will be able to take away from that. I'm going to move us on quickly into the wrap-up portion of today's webinar. Sorry, get my slides going. I think there's been quite a few themes that we've managed to wrap up across the 3 panel discussions, and hopefully there's been something that all of you have been able to take away from the expertise and experience of our 3 panelists here with us today. We've covered a lot, and I want to remind you that all of the resources, so the guidance report that you can see on screen on the far left, we also have a self-assessment guide, which you can see in the middle of the screen, and then 2 one-page resources, which are on promoting high-quality talk in maths and using storybooks to promote high-quality mathematical talk. These are all available for free on the E4L website, so you can scan the QR code there, or you can use the link in chat, which I think Danielle has put in there. Thank you for that. What's not shown here, but what we have mentioned, is the 2 videos that we have at the moment, one from Juanita and one from another educator named Co. We will be adding to these videos over time, and if you feel inspired from what you heard this evening and you think that you might like to share some of your practice with us, then I really encourage you to reach out, because we're always keen to hear more about how our resources are being used and what this looks like in practice in your settings. In terms of next steps for tonight's webinar, I want to thank you all so much for your participation this afternoon. I know it can be a really big ask to sit down at the end of a busy day and listen to people talking. So we really appreciate the questions coming through in the chat and your comments coming through as well. Before we close out this session, I'd really encourage you to take a moment and pop into the chat box one key takeaway from today's webinar. We'd really love to know what's resonated with you. What's the thing that you're going to be taking away today? Maths talk coming up straight away. That's wonderful to see. A lot of thank you coming through for our panelists, which I will absolutely be reiterating. Once you've had a chance to think about it and put in the chat what your takeaway is for today, we'd also really like you to complete a 2-minute survey, which many of the questions are multiple choice, and your answers will just really help us to understand a little bit about you, but also to improve our future webinar sessions. There's a QR code on the screen. Otherwise, Danielle has put the link in the chat, but I realised by me asking you to put all of your responses in the chat. Oh, she's popped it in there again. Excellent. It's towards the bottom. Oh, it's wonderful to see so many of your responses coming through. Manipulatives, authentic experiences, maths talk, again, lots of maths talk, intentional part of the curriculum. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all for that. While you're completing that survey, I will take us over to a keep in touch and thank you. So thank you again, everybody online, for your participation this afternoon. We really do appreciate you registering, all of the questions that you asked while you were registering, and for your participation. To stay up to date with Evidence for Learning, you can sign up to our e-newsletter by following the link that Danielle will pop in the chat, or you can follow us across social media platforms if you don't already. I would really like to take a moment, though, to especially thank each of our panellists, Marina, James and Juanita, for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. And I really hope that all of you got at least one thing that you can take away with you, whether that's, I can see people putting in manipulatives and representations, or whether it's just a thought that you might like to go and explore further, or to have a look in one of the guidance reports and see what that might look like in your context. Thank you again for joining us, and we really look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you about how you're putting these evidence-informed recommendations into practice.